I thought I'd do a quick series on how Mormons have changed America as a nation, because there's a number of significant effects that Mormonism has had on the nation. And so this is number one. When the Saints were expelled from Missouri and flooded into Illinois as refugees, they were met with a lot of compassion. And part of the compassion was the understanding that they could settle on the land, which was commerce, which they renamed Nauvoo, and that they would have an opportunity to create a city that would have some protections. Illinois was enacting a form of constitution for cities that incorporated them and gave them great powers over their own destinies. And this was modeled after the idea of states being able to have powers that connected it to other states, but it enabled them to be individualistic and write their own rules. Obviously, states had a responsibility to each other and to the federal government, and this was also the case with incorporated cities, with their charters, that they would have responsibilities to the state and the governor, but for the most part they could operate on their own. The Nauvoo City Charter was fashioned after the Springville Charter, and it was particularly written with some really lovely protections for the Saints because they had felt quite persecuted and they'd been driven out of Missouri, and so a militia was written into this charter. Habeas corpus was also written into the charter, and this was to protect citizens of the city against unlawful detainment, the idea that they might be taken away from the city to be tried on things that were spurious. The establishment of the Nauvoo Legion and the idea that the mayor and city councillors would be the justices in regard to the courts in Nauvoo, this made Nauvoo a place that, once Joseph had established a number of powers, he could enact them for his benefit. And so over the next 4 years, Joseph expanded the powers of the Nauvoo Charter to favour his opportunity to take care of things in Nauvoo the way that he would like. And this enabled Joseph to set up Nauvoo as a city-state, with the mayor, or him, as he became the mayor, as the head of state, which meant that he could do anything he wanted. Within the city limits, he had absolute power. He could bring people up on trial, he could dismiss accounts against them, and so anybody in the city, and Joseph Smith himself personally, couldn't be touched unless Joseph Smith wanted to enact that. He also made every male of a certain age enlist in the militia, which made the Nauvoo Legion one of the most powerful armies in the state. Now you can imagine these legal and military excesses really scared nearby cities and counties and created a lot of distrust, especially as Joseph started to become more and more militaristic in his views and his ways that he was talking about, particularly Missouri, who were trying to get him extradited, and also that he wanted to enact some revenge against Missouri for wrongs he believed that they had incurred against the Saints. This ended very badly in mid-1844, where Joseph brought the state of Illinois to the brink of civil war, and Governor Ford had to intervene with militia and threat to get Joseph to stand down. The Nauvoo City Charter was revoked in 1845, and without the legal and military protection that it once had, Nauvoo became a ghost town as Brigham Young and others fled to the west. And because of what Joseph did and how Nauvoo played out, this idea of city charters and the ways that it would be like a constitution, like a state or a federal constitution, that was disbanded across the United States and really hasn't been enacted like that again. One of the little known things about US history is how significant the Mormons are in creating the Republican Party. Not as you might think that the Mormons became Republicans, but the Republicans were a reaction to the threat of Mormonism. The Republican Party formed as an anti-Mormon movement. Let me explain. After Joseph Smith's assassination, Brigham Young took a number of saints and fled Nauvoo for Mexico, hoping to escape the United States. But along the way, that part of the continent was annexed after a war between America and Mexico. So Brigham Young moved the saints out of America to find that he was actually still in America. And fortunately, he was able to negotiate such that he became the territorial governor of Utah Territory. And by 1852, Brigham Young had set up a theocracy and had a large amount of power in determining what would happen in this part of the United States. So he made the bold move of implementing things that were important to him and to the church. And particularly one of those was polygamy. He now made that official, that the church was practicing polygamy and that it was the epitome of the Mormon understanding of heaven. He also designated the territory a slave-holding space. These two things enraged American citizens on the West Coast, particularly polygamy, because it was seen as a form of women's slavery, and also for the Northerners, this was an expansion of slavery to the territories which they were fighting against. The US was already deeply divided on slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had brokered this tenuous peace with the idea that if you're going to include states in the Union, you had to equally put in slave states and non-slave states. But what Brigham Young was doing in the West by declaring Utah a territory, a slave-holding space, this flew in the face of this kind of a compromise. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was supposed to alleviate some of this tension, but it actually inflamed it, and there were race riots with the idea of slavery versus anti-slavery people in the territories that were now being established. The Whig Party, which had been involved in US politics significantly up to this point, had a resounding collapse. In the wake of that, the Republican Party formed on the basis that it was anti-slavery, and it sought to abolish slavery across the whole of the United States entirely. One of the challenges to this was that states were like mini countries, and most people didn't believe in slavery and didn't agree with it, but they also believed that what another state did, you couldn't interfere with. So this was that kind of standoff, the idea that, okay, well, I might not believe it, but I don't have the right to tell another state how they need to conduct their affairs. But territories were under the federal administration, and they needed to be in line with the federal understanding. And so the Republican Party, which formed in 1854, saw the ideas of polygamy as being women's slavery. These things were something that the government should do something about, and a territory is something that they should be administering, and they shouldn't allow this to be the case. So by 1856, the Republican platform was against the twin relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. And Utah, Brigham Young, and the Mormons were ground zero for this fight for righteous morality, which was being just evaded in the territories. The newly formed Republican Party didn't show well at the 1856 election, but it showed enough that people were worried, and particularly President Buchanan was worried about the Mormon threat, and he sent Johnston's army to Utah to depose Brigham Young as territorial governor. This led in 1857 to the Utah War, and this really ended in a bit of a stalemate, which was a loss for the federal government and for President Buchanan. He didn't manage to unseat Brigham Young, and he certainly didn't manage to take care of this polygamy problem. So while debates continued over the next 4 years, and the Democratic Party, which had been very strong, split over these lines of slavery, they fielded two candidates, a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat, in the 1860 election, and the Republicans fielded Abraham Lincoln. Because of the split vote, Abraham Lincoln won, and the rest of history was created. The Republican Party has its genesis in fighting against Brigham Young and the doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, namely polygamy and slavery, which was implemented by Brigham Young in 1852 as a public good, which the rest of the country declared was the most evil of anything. Let's talk about human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is Ulysses Grant. He's the 18th President of the United States, and he is a war hero from the Civil War, because when Abraham Lincoln was elected to be the president in 1860, several slave states in the South seceded from the Union. In trying to keep them, this triggered the Civil War. Now, Utah was a slave territory and should have actually been fighting on behalf of the South. But they were also practicing polygamy, which was abhorrent to most Americans, including the South. And at the same time, the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln sought quickly to try and address the polygamy situation in Utah. And they did this by enacting the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act in 1862 to address polygamy particularly, and to force the church into a defensive position. There is some speculation that Brigham Young and Abraham Lincoln came to an agreement that the federal government wouldn't pursue this anti-bigamy law as long as Utah did not enter the Civil War on behalf of the South. And so Utah Territory did not fight in the Civil War. But Utah, and particularly polygamy, became a political football for the next 30 years. And this meant that as successive Republican Party candidates like Ulysses Grant entered into politics and were the President of the United States, the polygamy issue became bigger and bigger, because this was something that they could say that they were doing something about that was abhorrent to the general American public. Have a look at this State of the Union address in 1871. This is from President Grant. In Utah, there still remains a remnant of barbarism repugnant to civilization, to decency, and to the laws of the United States. Territory officers, however, have been found who are willing to perform their duty in spirit of equity and with a due sense of the necessity of sustaining the majesty of the law. Neither polygamy nor any other violation of existing statutes will be permitted within the territory of the United States. It is not within the religion of the self-styled states that we now are dealing, but with their practices. They will be protected in the worship of God according to the dictates of their conscience, but they will not be permitted to violate the laws under the cloak of religion. And here he is again 4 years later. In nearly every annual message that has been I've had the honor of transmitting to Congress, I've called attention to the anomalous, not to say scandalous, conditions of affairs existing in the territory of Utah, and have asked for definite legislation to correct it, that polygamy should exist in a free, enlightened, and Christian country without the power to punish so flagrant a crime against decency and morality seems preposterous. True that there is no law to sustain this unnatural vice, but what is needed is a law to punish it as a crime, and at the same time to fix the status of innocent children, the offspring of this system, and of the possibly innocent plural wives. But as an institution, polygamy shall be banished from the land. I will repeat the recognized questions which I deem of vital importance, which may be legislated upon and settled at this session. Fourth, drive out licensed immorality such as polygamy and the importation of women for illegitimate purposes. President Grant is railing against human trafficking, the idea that the church is bringing particularly saints unaware from Europe and then putting them into positions of polygamy, that the sexual immorality, this scandalous practice, is against the principles of the United States. These are really big issues. These are presidents of the United States calling out the church and its practice of polygamy as a sexual barbarism and also human trafficking. There is a mini Gospel Topics essay on this, and it's actually quite good, so it's worth the read. It's called Anti-Polygamy Legislation, and basically goes through the things that I've just talked about, including, the church, or Brigham Young, announcing in 1852 the idea that polygamy is what's been practiced in Utah and is the foremost doctrine of the church, and how this provoked shock and outrage amongst American citizens. That in 1856, the Republican Party added to its platform the abolishment of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. And then 6 years later, so 1862, the Morrill Act for the suppression of polygamy, a law punishing bigamy. This was followed up by the Poland Act in 1874. And in 1879, the church took a case right through to the Supreme Court to test the United States on the First Amendment, the idea that protection of religion would be able. But the court ruled against the church and suggested that the First Amendment protected religious belief, but it did not protect religious practice. So in response, Latter-day Saints church leaders, they acted in civil disobedience. They went to prison, they went into hiding, they kept on practicing polygamy despite the fact that it was against the law. And the federal government intensified its resistance, and the Edmunds Act of 1882 punished unlawful cohabitation with fine or 6 months imprisonment. And when this failed to stop the practice, the Edmund-Tucker Act of 1887 increased penalties, including disenfranchising the church of its properties over $50,000, which meant that the Salt Lake Temple was now owned by the United States government. The church took another case to the Supreme Court to protest this and lost. And that ruling came out in 1890, and so that's when President Woodruff basically acquiesced, publicly at least, to say that they weren't going to practice any polygamy. But that's meant in this time, pregnant women went into hiding, many families moved to Canada and Mexico to stay together. Between 1885 and 1889, most apostles, stake presidents, and other church leaders were in hiding or in prison. And so Wilford Woodruff in 1890 effectively, acquiesced and started to end the practice of plural marriage. But this was all on the backs of presidents of the United States, including President Grant, who were Republicans who were pushing again and again and harder till the church gave this up. And for that reason, lots of the church members, when they started to become a state in 1896, did not vote Republican. They voted Democrat instead. But leaders of the church saw the Republican Party as something that they wanted to, get closer to, and so this changed into the 20th century. And so that's how accusations of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints led to major changes in law in the United States. And, really the saints tested this right through to the Supreme Court and lost. Cody asks this great question. How was the immorality of polygamy so easily seen by the US government and most US citizens, yet Mormons were so blind to what a horrible practice it was? There are lots of reasons for this, but one of the biggest ones was that when saints decided to follow Brigham Young, participate in polygamy in the temple in Nauvoo, and then flee the United States because it was illegal, they kind of sealed their fate, that their leaders were the ones that they were going to follow regardless of what those leaders did. And the reports out of Salt Lake City were horrific. The kinds of things that were going on in Utah were really problematic. Here's a really good example. This man is Lorenzo Snow. He's actually the 5th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He is born in 1814 and he becomes the church president in 1898, and then he dies in 1901. He first gets married when he is 30 years old, and he ends up having 8 wives, of which he has 42 children. Now, if you look down the list, you'll see a familiar name. That is Phoebe Amelia Woodruff, who he married in 1859. Who is this woman? Well, she's actually not a woman. She is a teenager. She was born on the 4th of March, 1842, and she married Lorenzo Snow on the 4th of April, 1859. She is 1 month older than her 17th birthday, and this is the day after Lorenzo Snow's birthday because he's born on the 3rd of April. She is the daughter of Wilford Woodruff, who was a fellow apostle in the Quorum of the 12. Effectively, Lorenzo Snow married his friend's daughter, teenage daughter, and they went on to have 5 children. The first child was born in 1860, so this was an immediate sexual relationship. Phoebe Woodruff Snow died in 1919 at the age of 76. But what is really curious and what is never talked about is the idea that the 5th president of the church was the son-in-law of the 4th president of the church. Phoebe Amelia was not Lorenzo Snow's last wife. He married Sarah Minnie Jensen in 1871 when he was 59 years old and she was 15. Sarah Jensen was born October 10th, 1855. She was married to Lorenzo Snow on June the 12th, 1871 at the age of 15. And they went on to have 5 children together. This was considered an exemplary family. This was the epitome of Mormon relationship. This was the 5th president of the church, who has now married the daughter of the 4th president of the church. These are the kinds of things that are going on in the church by its top leaders. These are the kinds of things that the US government and US citizens are incredibly concerned about. They see this as human trafficking. Because what starts off as daughters being married off to fellow friends is the idea that women were brought from Europe without a knowledge of what was going to happen to them and ending up in these polygamous marriages too. Vulnerable women being trafficked for these problematic marriages. Did you know that the threat of Mormon invasion led to the United States purchase of Alaska? This man here is William Seward. He was the Secretary of State from 1861 through to 1869, and he's largely responsible for the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. This was an incredible deal. $7.2 million for a huge tract of land. In fact, even with inflation, it's only $134 million today. This was a bargain. But why was it such a bargain? There were a lot of things going on in the 1850s and 60s in the United States, in Russia, and also in the United Kingdom. Remember, at this particular time, Britain is one of the biggest empires in the world. And Russia has a big foothold, but it's lost a lot of money in its war in Crimea, and it's struggling a little bit. But it has this little bit of foothold separating it from its rival, the United Kingdom, called Alaska. Canada is part of the British Empire, and it's right on Russia's doorstep. Also at the same time, Brigham Young has left the United States in order to go to Mexico, but by the time he's got to the Utah Basin, it's now part of the United States. Fortunately, he managed to broker a deal to make himself the territorial governor. But this all fell over in 1852 when he pronounced that the church was practicing polygamy and that the territory would be a slave territory. The Republican Party was formed to fight against these evils and made a good showing at the 1856 election. President Buchanan, who won, needed to do something about the Mormons, and so he sent troops with Johnson's army to depose Brigham Young. So Brigham looked at other ways of now leaving the United States again and where they might go, and one of those options was Alaska. Here's an article from 1920, the New York Times, talking about the purchase of Alaska. In the end of 1857, the Russian minister took alarm on hearing that Brigham Young was planning to found a Mormon colony either in the Hudson Bay Company territory or in Alaska. He sounded President Buchanan, who laughingly said that it mattered little to him where the Mormons went if they would only cease to be a problem to him. Stockwell reported the unpleasant rumor to the Tsar, who was impressed. Nobody wanted Brigham Young and his polygamists. This was the beginning of negotiations with the United States that Alaska might be purchased by them. The purchase was delayed because of the Civil War, and so it happened in 1867. America at this time was not a particular threat to Russia, and certainly in the midst of a civil war, it didn't look like America had much of a presence or even a future. But they were at least not the United Kingdom, and therefore the idea that Alaska could go to America was more favorable. Ultimately, Brigham Young held his ground, rebuffed Buchanan, and brokered a tenuous peace. Thoughts of moving to Alaska were scuttled by the Alaskan Purchase in 1867, and then the church looked at opportunities in Mexico and Canada where they formed colonies. And then by 1890, the church under Wilford Woodruff decided that it was better to acquiesce to giving up polygamy rather than leaving the United States. So this led to statehood for Utah in 1896, and really the establishment of the church being American rather than Mexican, Canadian, or even Russian.